I'm not making an appeal to the law. I'm making an appeal to morality and logic. But if you're asking me if the cops blew up a building, like not in your bullshit scenario, but in the scenario of what Israel's actually doing here, yeah, no, they'd go to jail for life without parole or get the death penalty. I mean, she's just completely wrong about this. Like completely wrong. Like, no, it's not the case. It's not the case that if somebody takes hostages, that now they are 100% morally responsible for whatever the response is to that. That's just not true. However, if they level the building, then they are guilty of murder. And I'm not even talking about the law. The law would be on my side on this. I'm saying morally speaking, you intentionally killed these innocent people. Take a look at Gaza. Which one do you think that is? Do you think it was a sniper who missed and hit a kid? No. They leveled the whole goddamn. Israel embarked on a policy that they knew with 100% certainty would result in women and children being slaughtered.
So here's the deal. After Dave Smith's explosive appearance on Joe Rogan last month, where he dismantled Douglas Murray's pro-Israel talking points like a Jenga tower made of lies, along came Elica, a UK-raised, LA-polished attorney turned influencer who moonlights as a singer and a part-time moral philosopher when international law gets too boring. In a post-Joe Rogan rebuttal video, she tries to legally drag Dave Smith's Gaza analogy through the mud like a failed courtroom drama. But Dave Smith is not having it. What starts as a critique quickly turns into a masterclass in how to miss the point entirely, as Elica insists that cops, chains of events, and hostage playground somehow justifies leveling apartment blocks full of civilians. Yeah, but Dave, with his precision and zero patience for legal sleight of hand, rips her analogies to shreds, you'll see, and calls out the disturbing logic hiding beneath her polished look. If Israel does it, it's moral, but if anyone else did, it's terrorism. Be the judge of it for yourself. Let's jump in.
We were on Piers Morgan once together, and we debated a little bit about some of the foreign policy stuff, and it wasn't whatever. I'm not trying to be mean. She wasn't particularly impressive to me, and it wasn't a particularly constructive debate, but whatever. And not debate, but one of these Piers Morgan panels. But anyway, so she put out a video responding to me making this point on Douglas Murray, on Joe Rogan's podcast, debating Douglas Murray. So let's go through this a little bit, and then there's another video that I want to respond to as well. So let's start off with this.
Douglas Murray and Dave Smith recently appeared on an episode of Joe Rogan, and there are these constant false analogies. Here was Dave Smith's analogy. If somebody comes and kills a member of your family and you seek revenge against them, and you know where they live, and you go out and blow up their entire building with them alongside men, women, and children inside, you would be convicted of murder of all of them. That is correct. However, that is a false analogy, and we're going to explain why. Two key omissions and contortions are, number one, who has the authority to respond, and number two, what is the objective of responding? In the analogy given, there is a private individual whose motivation is to exact revenge. This is called vigilante justice, and it is illegal. So we understand, first of all, that the analogy is incorrect because a civilian is not the authorized body to respond. Second of all, what is the objective of responding?
Okay, let's pause it here. So yeah, this is you could say we all understand, but this is just nothing. It has nothing to do with the analogy at all. It doesn't even matter. First of all, it's just not true. So like legally speaking, she's not even right. You technically have all of the rights of the cops. Okay, I shouldn't say that. You don't have all the rights of the cops, but cops aren't allowed to kill people aggressively. They're allowed to use self-defense. So are you. You can actually make a citizen's arrest. But regardless of any of that, you see already how this completely misses the point. They don't have the authority. Again, that's a social construct. That's something we're deciding. And by the way, think about the, she's saying it's a false analogy or whatever, which is completely wrong. But think about this concept. This is one of the things that just immediately falls apart about the idea of democracy. You're like, okay, they have the authority. Okay, where'd they get that authority from? We, the people. Okay, so then the people have that authority. How can the people grant a group of people authority that they themselves never had, right? It's all just ridiculous. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So change the analogy to law enforcement then, okay? So if law enforcement was pursuing a bad guy and that bad guy goes into a building with a lot of innocent people and then the sheriff said, blow up the building, we would convict that sheriff of murder. And if anybody went there, he goes, no, it was totally unintentional that he killed all those people. We'd go, what? No, it wasn't. He knew the people were in there. Go, yeah, but he only wanted to get the bad guy. That's just ridiculous. So again, this isn't an omission. I guess maybe I just assumed that people could figure this part out for themselves, so I didn't spell it out exactly, but it's not an omission and it doesn't change the analogy at all. The analogy does not fail. It doesn't matter. Again, it's a demonstration that you're fundamentally missing the point of what I'm saying when you start going, well, that's because they're not the cops. My whole point is it doesn't matter. The whole point is it does not matter. If it's immoral for people to do it to somebody else, then it's also immoral for people to do it to somebody else, even if those people happen to have blue uniforms and badges on. That doesn't change the moral characteristic of an action. That's the fundamental point. So no, you've done nothing so far. All right, let's keep playing.
That's also illegal. Nobody, not even the authorities, have the right to exact revenge. The correct equivalent is that the authorities, who are the authorized body to respond, are acting not out of revenge, but for the purpose of retrieval. Not just retrieval, but the capture of an individual who has committed a crime and has evaded responsibility and has verbally promised to commit the same crime 1,000 times more. Now let's give an accurate analogy.
Okay, let's pause it before she goes to her accurate analogy. Again, she's bringing in the hostages here, and like you can do that. I'll still go through this analogy with the hostages, but just to be clear, like this is the game that these people who support this war in Gaza play, is that there's always from the very beginning been what they call like the dual goal of the war, right? They've always said it's retrieving the hostages and eliminating Hamas. So I'm more talking about the eliminating Hamas part. But if you're going to get into if retrieval is the only goal, like, okay, but you're still in the same situation. You still don't have the right to kill innocent people. Like, now, again, I'm not claiming that there's no scenario where, all things being considered, reasonable people might support a policy where innocent people die. I'm making the point that you can't claim it's not intentional. The concept of intentionality does not magically transform. Now, if you were trying to retrieve someone, let's say, again, make it a domestic comparison. So the cops are dealing with a what's the word I'm looking, a hostage situation. Okay. Well, first of all, what the cops do in that situation is they call in what's known as a negotiator, and you negotiate with the person who's taking the hostages. Now, if a sniper can get a clean shot, meaning we have reasonably high suspicion that nobody else will be hurt in this, then that's one thing. But if somebody were to come in, let's say they kidnap one of your kids and they go hold them up somewhere, and the sniper says, I have a shot, it'll kill 3 other kids, but we could kill the guy and then retrieve the kid, they'd be like, no. Because you can't kill 3 kids to save 1 kid, because when it's domestically, we view all human life as equal. It's not the case with Israel-Palestine. But then I would just make the other point is that because she brings in that they've threatened to do it 1,000 times over, which certainly is true. Hamas has made some threats about, there's several, or at least 3 high-level Hamas people who I've heard say that they're going to do as many October 7th as possible. But this is kind of a distraction from the point. It doesn't... Threats, when you're talking about what you're allowed to do based off threats, a huge element of that is how credible the threat is. So if I'm walking down the street, if a crazy random person puts a gun to my head and says, I'm going to fucking kill you, and I can get to a gun quick enough, I have the right to kill that person. That is self-defense. If I'm walking down the street and a homeless schizophrenic person mutters to themselves, I'm going to fucking kill you, and then I pull out a gun and shoot them in the head, I'm guilty of murder. Like, that was not self-defense. And similarly, the question doesn't just become what is Hamas threatened, it's more like, and is this actually achievable? You know, like, for example, our political leadership has threatened Iran up and down. I mean, Donald Trump himself, John McCain, when he was running for president, said, if you remember famously, what's that Beatles song? Bomb, 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 bomb Iran. Like, he thought it was a joke. That we threaten Iran constantly. Now, if Iran were, which they do have the capability to do, were to like blow, you know, send a missile to one of our bases in the region and kill a whole bunch of our soldiers, they couldn't go, well, yeah, you guys threatened us, so we had a right to respond. Not everybody here, including you, Iranian lady, would be like, no, that was an act of aggression. So it's just a little beside the point. But anyway, it has nothing to do with the analogy anyway. All right, so let's go to her better analogy.
Analogy. A kidnapper breaks into your house and steals your child. You don't go after the kidnapper, you call the authorities. Law enforcement then pursues that kidnapper, but what that kidnapper does is he goes and hides himself in a school playground. He buries himself amongst a bunch of children, and he's got that child in his arms. In this scenario, law enforcement has the right to act. They don't have carte blanche, but they have the right to act. And not only do they have the right, they must act. Because failure to act is immorality. Failure to act leads to the potential death of that child. This is a non-negotiable. To claim otherwise is immorality itself. A response is a moral obligation.
Okay, so let's pause it right there. She's again going back and forth between the law and morality here. I am not making an appeal to the law, but again, the law is a social construct. Morality is not. They're very different. Slavery was the law of the land. You know, I don't know if the Holocaust was technically the law, but certainly Adolf Hitler changed the laws to be able to disarm the Jewish people and seize their businesses and put them in concentration camps. You know, the law, when we're talking about what's right and wrong, the law doesn't matter. What matters is morality. Now, if you're going to say, because by the way, legally speaking, in fact, our Supreme Court has ruled on this, legally speaking, cops don't have an obligation to act. But if you want to say they have a moral obligation to act, I would probably agree with you in some cases. But again, it's awfully vague to just say act. Nobody's saying you're not allowed to act. We're saying you're not allowed to murder women and children. So like, that's kind of different. All right, let's keep playing.
Law enforcement officer shoots at the kidnapper. And as a result of that, the children around the kidnapper die. Who do you think bears the legal, moral, and factual responsibility?
Okay, so just
for
pause
those
it
children's
again.
death?
Yes, nobody is arguing. In my scenario, if the sniper goes, I have a clean shot at his head, he shoots him, takes him out, but then the bullet also hits a kid accidentally. Yeah, nobody's claiming, yeah, the moral responsibility of that would be on the person who took them hostage. It was a mistake, certainly, to take that shot, but he didn't realize it was a mistake. However, if they level the building, then they are guilty of murder. And I'm not even talking about the law. The law would be on my side on this. I'm saying, morally speaking, you intentionally killed these innocent people. Take a look at Gaza. Which one do you think that is? Do you think it was a sniper who missed and hit a kid? No. They leveled the whole goddamn. Israel embarked on a policy that they knew with 100% certainty would result in women and children being slaughtered. That's intentional. It doesn't matter how much you try to dress up this analogy. Okay, there were hostages. Yes, okay. Absolutely. Does Israel have a right to try to retrieve those hostages? Do they have a moral obligation to try to retrieve those hostages? Sure. That's beside the point. It's not what I'm talking about. All right, let's keep playing.
I'm not going to make you guess. It's very simple. The kidnapper, in all cases. Let's talk about why. Because the kidnapper set off a chain of events that made it so that the law enforcement officer had to respond. And that response led to the deaths of children. That kidnapper is the but-for cause of those deaths.
Okay, let's pause it here for a second, because this is just, I mean, this logic is ridiculous. And she's, as I've seen a couple, I guess she's a lawyer. I've seen a couple of these lawyers who try to defend these policies just abuse the but-for clause, which is like not at all what it means. Like the but-for clause is like something that they'll use in court cases to kind of like establish, like it's limited in scope, right? So like if you're drunk driving and you hit somebody and they go, but for you being drunk, you wouldn't have hit this person, then okay, we can establish responsibility. But this is just totally abusing it. Like you set off a chain of events, therefore responsibility goes out the window. Like if again, in the example, which is much closer to what we're talking about here, which is law enforcement blows up the building and kills a bunch of innocent civilians, they can't go, but for this guy taking someone hostage, I wouldn't have done it. Even if that's true, they'd still be guilty. It doesn't matter. You can't say, oh, you set off a chain of events, therefore, as she just admitted, you don't have carte blanche, so then your entire argument here falls apart. That's not the case. It's not the case that just because someone set off a chain of events, therefore nobody else has any responsibility for how they act. And again, if you really were to take this to its ultimate logical conclusion, right, then it would be carte blanche. Israel could do anything they wanted to Gaza, right? I mean, they could round up the population and just shoot everybody in the head. They could drop nukes on Gaza and say, hey, they set off a chain of events. Now, we all know on some level that this is complete horseshit. All right, let's keep playing.
Knowingly and intentionally buried himself among innocent children in order to evade capture. It is that is immoral. It is that is repugnant. And it is that caused the death of the children. I'm not saying this as a matter of opinion. Let me reiterate, that is factually, morally, and legally the case. The next question then is, would the law enforcement officer face any responsibility? Yes. That is also possibly the case in the instance that their actions were negligent, or in the instance that they had another alternative that would not have involved harming those children. They would probably not face criminal consequences, but there may be some consequences regardless.
Okay, let's pause it again. No, they'd face criminal consequences. I mean, again, I'm not making an appeal to the law. I'm making an appeal to morality and logic. But if you're asking me, if the cops blew up a building, like not in your bullshit scenario, but in the scenario of what Israel's actually doing here, yeah, no, they'd go to jail for life without parole or get the death penalty because it's premeditated murder. Intentionally killing innocent civilians is premeditated murder. And intentionally killing innocent civilians when you do it in a uniform is still the same thing. All right, let's keep playing.
Listen to me good. There is no scenario where that kidnapper is not 100% morally, legally, and factually responsible for those deaths. Now, let's make the analogy to the war in Gaza.
Okay, let's just pause it for a second. I mean, she's just completely wrong about this. Like, completely wrong. Like, no, it's not the case. It's not the case that if somebody takes hostages, that now they are 100% morally responsible for whatever the response is to that. That's just not true. And again, in the example, if the cops leveled the building and killed all those people, nobody would accept that, oh, sorry, we're not responsible because somebody kidnapped a child. Therefore, we could kill a whole bunch more children. Nobody would accept that domestically. And it's shocking that she would even attempt to make that argument and then state it as a factual certainty. You're absolutely wrong. No one would accept it. It would be horrifically immoral. The cops would be 100% morally responsible for their response. And also in any civilized country, they'd go to jail for the rest of their lives or be put to death for murder in the first degree. All right, let's keep playing.
Hamas broke into Israel on October 7th, not just slaughtered 1,200 people, but kidnapped hundreds more, and then went back to Gaza. That triggered the right of Israel to retrieve those hostages, not to exact revenge, but to retrieve. Secondly, when Hamas said, we promise to do this 1,000 times more, that triggered the right of Israel to prevent that 1,000 times more by dismantling the group that made such a promise.
Okay, let's just pause it here again. Again, this is just batting down straw men, which seems to be a really common theme amongst people who are supporting this war. Nobody I've ever heard, and I've heard some pretty fringe radical views on this stuff, I've never heard anybody say that Israel doesn't have a right to retrieve their hostages and doesn't have a right to take out Hamas. Never heard anyone say that. Has anyone ever, by the way, a bunch of Hamas people got killed on October 7th. I don't know the exact number. But, you know, on October 7th, the IDF, many hours later, did end up responding. There were firefights and they killed some Hamas people. Has anybody ever objected to that? Has anybody ever claimed that they didn't have a right to kill the perpetrators of October 7th? I certainly haven't heard anyone say that. And that's certainly not what I'm saying if you're doing a video responding to me. So why we're talking about killing the innocent women and children. We're not talking about retrieving your hostages or taking out Hamas militants. That's never been what the conversation was about. So you could say they have a right to do that. Just like, again, imagine in my analogy, or a mix of our two analogies, whatever here, but imagine there's somebody kidnaps a kid, they go into a school building, the sheriff comes down, he goes, blow up the building, blows up the building, kills a whole bunch of kids, and then turned around and said, hey, I had a right to retrieve that hostage, and I had a right to kill that kidnapper. Yeah, that's not really the point. I think we'd all see that pretty clearly. All right, let's keep playing.
Decision that set off a chain of events that led to a war, and every single death that results from that war is caused by Hamas. Does Israel have any responsibility? Of course. Let's say that because of poor intelligence, Israel was led to believe that Hamas militants were within a particular building. Turns out that intelligence was wrong, and Israel strikes that building and kills innocent people. If that intelligence was shaky, if there was no strong reason to suspect that Hamas were in there, that would constitute negligent or reckless behavior. In such a case, Israel would also bear the responsibility for those deaths. However, under no circumstances, because Hamas set off this chain of events, under no circumstances would Hamas not be responsible for those deaths, the deaths in that very building. So when Hamas bears the responsibility for all of these deaths, and Israel bears shared responsibility, why is it that when we talk about objective immorality, we don't talk about the cause of that immorality? And that's exactly the point that Douglas Murray was making. Anybody can be against war. Not everybody understands the cause of that war. Everybody can say they know the difference between right and wrong. Not everybody understands the source of that wrong. And that is the difference between moral grandstanding and moral clarity.
Okay, so we can wrap up there. That's the end of the video there. I mean, I think she doesn't really add anything else after that. It's just a weird, it's easy to oppose slaughtering women and children. Not everybody can support it. Okay. Again, you just see how ridiculous this is. It's funny in a way because, look, what I started out with on the analogy here, that I think you'd have to recognize, it's not an opinion. It's a description of reality. And so to try to twist yourself into pretzels here, to be like, oh, Hamas started the whole thing, Israel cannot have responsibility for that. Yeah, no, actually they can. Actually they can. If you are implementing a policy knowing that it's going to result in innocent people being killed, you're responsible for that. And there's again, the real problem here is not the logic of what I'm saying. The problem is the implications. That's the issue that you have. Because once you accept what I'm saying is obviously correct, then you'd have to be like, oh, so maybe I'm supporting mass murder here.
And that's the end of this farce. Elica Laban tried to wrap state violence in legal ribbon, but Dave Smith came in and tore it down like a damp wallpaper. Her entire argument is built on courtroom theater, fancy language, hollow logic, and not a single ounce of accountability for the actual dead civilians we're talking about. She waffles on about authority and response objectives, like it's a civil dispute over parking tickets, while Israel turns entire residential block into ash. And she has the gall to suggest that Hamas being immoral somehow gives Israel free pass to flatten neighborhoods. That's not justice. That's moral outsourcing with blood on your hands. But let's be clear, Dave Smith isn't just right, he's uncomfortably right. That's why it rattles people like Elica. He exposed the stitched up logic that says murder is fine if your side does it, and worse, he pointed out what most won't dare say: you cannot outsource your ethics to governments and call it righteous. Her analogy fell apart the moment you swap uniforms for intent. Would you accept it if the British police dropped a bomb on a block of flats in Birmingham to catch one fugitive? No. Then why accept it in Gaza? This isn't complicated. It's not abstract. It's moral cowardice hiding behind legalese. And Dave called it line by line. If you're tired of the double standard, share this, speak out, and drop a comment below. Because if morality falls under a flag, it was never moral to begin with. Catch you later.